We have Collin Long, Director of Government Affairs at OOIDA, talking about the insurance increase, taking it from 750,000 minimum to 2 million, which is a heck of a hike. Collin, how are you this morning?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
We're excited to hear from you, Collin. This is kind of an angle that we don't get a lot. We don't really talk about what's going on in the governmental side unless we're talking to John Gallagher, our Washington correspondent. So talk to us a little bit about what you guys are doing at OOIDA and where you guys are working with the government.
Yeah, sure. And on the insurance increase, it's, I think, important to keep in mind this has not been enacted into law yet. We're still working to try and make sure it's not, because of the damage it could do to mid-sized, small fleets, and especially owner-operators. It's still working its way through the legislative process. Right now, it's in a House bill that has passed the House. The Senate is not, at this point, jumping on board yet. They've stayed clear of it, probably because they have to walk a fine line over there, keeping Republican support, which is critical for them passing their highway bill. So our fight now kind of shifts focus over to the Senate, trying to make sure that senators remain opposed or at least leery of getting on board this increase because of the damage it will do to countless businesses back home. And I think it's important to remember this doesn't just affect trucking. It affects everyone who uses trucks, who relies on trucks, who depends on trucks. So farming, agriculture, the materials industry, towers, they've all joined us in this fight against this unnecessary insurance increase. And I say unnecessary simply because the only federal research on this issue tells us that 99% of crashes are covered by the current minimum. So we don't see a real need to increase the rates. It's simply a way to line the pockets of trial lawyers here in Washington.
Yeah, Collin, there's a lot of stats being thrown out there, and one of the reasons I think we've covered it quite a bit here because it is very important to the trucking industry and to everybody in the trucking industry. But I would imagine much more so to those owner-operators that are out there that make up the majority of the trucks on the road anyways, right? The smaller fleets, and those guys are strapped. Many of them are working, making this run to finance the next run many times throughout it, right, Collin? So those are the people that are really the most in danger. But then you also have the larger fleets that aren't too happy about this as well, right?
I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think a problem we've encountered fighting this for a number of years here in Washington is that well, first off, there's a lot of new lawmakers here in D.C. They don't necessarily understand the trucking industry because we haven't been able to educate them yet.
Right.
But a lot of them don't understand the role that small businesses play in trucking. And when they see an increase from $750,000 to $2 million, they think of all the large carriers on the road and they assume they have deep pockets. They can handle this type of increase. When in actuality, I mean, 96% of motor carriers are small businesses, and that's kind of OOIDA's bread and butter member. But it's not just OOIDA who's fighting this from the trucking industry. I mean, we have over 20 state trucking associations on board, primarily because they are comprised of mid-size and small carriers. So together, our voice has been pretty strong here in Washington. Obviously, not strong enough to prevent the House from moving on this, but I think senators, thankfully, have a little bit more awareness of what type of impact this will have on our industry, from small to mid to large carriers. And we're a little bit disappointed that a lot of the large carriers have kind of stayed out of this fight simply because it'll squeeze the little guys, their little competitors, by increasing their costs pretty dramatically overnight.
That's a good
So
point. Not everything that is negative towards trucking is opposed by the larger carriers because of that. 96% of their competitors are small guys, right?
You're absolutely right. And we see that time and time again on a lot of trucking policies that are making their way through Washington. This is one that I think has really defined the differences between the large carriers and the mid and small size carriers, because the large carriers, like I said, have generally taken a pass on this one. They're fine with letting it be enacted into law, which doesn't necessarily help our fight. But, our coalition keeps growing. The more people find out about this and what type of impact it'll do to them, even if they're not in the trucking industry, if they're just reliant on trucking, the stronger our voice gets. And right now it needs to be as strong as possible because half of Congress has already passed an increase to $2 million. And we're trying to make sure the other half doesn't go on board.
Collin, so as this bill moved through the House and is now getting ready to move through the Senate, do you guys have a gauge on if this was a partisan issue, or is there kind of this room for the moderate Democrats are more on the side of, maybe let's give a little bit more caution to these small businesses and not taking such a progressive stance on this?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. The House is much more partisan than the Senate at this point. And if you've noticed on this issue, if you've been tracking it like we have, time and time again, it's been a very, very partisan issue. Democrats have supported it very strongly. Republicans have fought it with us very strongly. Over in the Senate, it's a different picture because the Senate is split 50-50. There are still moderate Democrats alive and well in the Senate. We've already spoken to many of them. They understand our perspective on the issue. They're reluctant to get on board with this proposal because a lot of them, quite frankly, are watching out for their next election. And I think that's where truckers and folks who are going to be impacted by this really need to start weighing in. They need to call their senators, especially some senators from, say, West Virginia, Arizona, Michigan. Pick up the phone and give them a call because they're really going to be the ones who make or break our efforts on this issue.
I like the way you slid that in there. So tell me this, Collin. What is the argument for the increase, right? Let's tear this down from that perspective, right?
Yeah.
Because it can't be just, hey, you know what? I'm going to help out my trial lawyer buddies, right, or my insurance lawyers.
Well, you'd be surprised how much of it is that.
I agree, but it can't be the official argument, right?
No, you're right. And the trial lawyers, who are frankly the leading proponents of this issue, have been saying, this level hasn't been increased in decades, and healthcare costs have certainly increased over that time. And we're not arguing with that. I mean, yeah, healthcare costs certainly have increased, and the $750,000 level was set years and years and years ago, and it hasn't been increased as well. But the fact of the matter is that damages in 99% of crashes are being covered. So you can make up a need, but when federal research tells you there's no need because 99% of crashes are covered, we always go back to that point because we think it's the strongest case we can make, and really it's the only federal data on this issue. A lot of the proponents of the trial lawyers will talk about, a lot of proponents and the trial lawyers will talk about how much health costs have increased over the years, but they never ever admit to the fact that most crashes continue to be covered by the current minimum, which is $750,000, and they completely ignore the fact that most motor carriers probably cover or have a coverage of about $1 million. They're above the federal minimum simply because that's what the market dictates, and we think that's an indication that the market actually knows what it's doing. Insurers know what they're doing. They know what their exposure is, and they've set that $1 million kind of industry norm because it covers them and it covers our members and other motor carriers. So we think there's really no need to touch it.
Collin, so there's a lot of talk around the industry about safety developments and safety improvements, whether that's lane control awareness and automatic braking, and now we're talking about automation as far as drivers go, safety drivers in these automated trucks. Are you guys doing any targeted research or trying to lobby any of this? Hey, look at all these safety advancements that we're trying to push through the industry, and maybe take that approach as why this increase isn't necessarily necessary because we're already bumping up our safety in pretty much every aspect. So bumping up the money doesn't necessarily mean being safer.
Yeah, but I would argue that devices, equipment, and technology doesn't necessarily mean you're safer either, especially when the driver's training has been reduced year after year after year, and folks are still not training drivers properly. And we think there's a lot of good marketing going on with safety devices and equipment. That doesn't necessarily mean that they should be mandated for use in our industry because, right now Congress is considering an automatic emergency braking mandate. A lot of our members have used that technology. A lot of our members have shared their concerns and their complaints with that technology: false activation, distracting warning, activation in inclement weather when they would prefer to have control over the vehicle. So even when there's kind of this concept that everyone embraces because it's been used on automobiles, certainly it can be transferred to heavy vehicles. We say, whoa, let's pump the brakes here because you need to appreciate the fact that drivers have a lot of concerns and really real-time experience with these devices that give us a little bit of pause about mandating them in a year or two from now. So, it runs the gamut on all these technology devices. If there's a technology device or equipment that is proven to improve safety in a cost-effective way, we're going to support it, and we have in the past. But right now, a lot of the devices out there are simply being marketed rather than actually being proven to improve safety.
Yeah. So, Collin, let's touch on something that you or dig into something just for a minute or two that you touched on real briefly before. And I think it's an interesting point that you mentioned that you've got new people in government and you have to re-educate them. So every year or 2 years, you've got to re-educate a whole new group of folks and get them to understand something that you also mentioned, that private enterprise can almost govern itself. Isn't that strange? What a strange concept that private industry can actually run things fairly decently. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, there's over 400 elected officials here in Washington, D.C., having their say in trucking policy. And I think I can count the ones with trucking experience on a single hand. And that makes it very difficult because we're not even saying a lot of these folks have business experience. I mean, a lot of them come from law firms, the political world, elected officials at other state and local levels. They don't necessarily understand what it takes to run a business, let alone a small business in an industry as competitive as trucking. So every 2 years, I mean, we kind of start fresh with educating 100 new elected officials about what's going on in trucking and how the policies that people are proposing affect our members. But we still have to keep educating veteran lawmakers who come back and return because, like you said, the technology evolves and there's always new issues to bring up. So it's really challenging here in Washington to get people to understand and appreciate the role of small business trucking. And I say it all the time. I encourage small business truckers and folks who make their living behind the wheel to run for office because we need those voices on every level of government, state, county, local, especially here in DC. I mean, it'd make my life a lot easier here in DC if I could go into an office and talk to someone who has a base knowledge of what I'm talking about, might even know it better than I do. So active truckers on the government level, advocates, grassroots advocacy, even running for office would greatly enhance our capabilities here in Washington.
Excellent stuff. Thank you so much, Collin.
Two great calls to action
Yeah.
there. You keep fighting the good fight, Collin. Thank you so much for joining us on FreightWaves
Thank you.
Now.
I appreciate being here. Thanks for having me.